Welcome, and thank you for joining me once again as we walk through the book of Acts. Today's a particularly interesting bit of a confrontation, a bit of a tension, dealing with racial issues, dealing with how the churches work together and help each other. It's a unique passage. We have both Jews and Gentiles once again meeting in Jerusalem as Paul heads back towards Jerusalem with his famine relief contribution that apparently the Jewish elders there didn't know was coming. So Paul and his group are coming back to Jerusalem. When we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went with us to James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified God. And they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law, and they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore whatever we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment, that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality." Then Paul took the men, and the next day purified himself along with them, and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and the offering presented for each one of them. So that's our text for today. It's a briefer text, but it's one that has a lot going on inside of it. Paul's traveling with a large group, fairly large group, of Gentile Christians. Each of his entourage are representatives from the churches among the Gentiles, the churches at Philippi and Thessalonica and all the other churches that Paul started, Colossae, and so they've all brought contributions from their respective churches for the famine relief in Judea. All of Judea is experiencing a famine, and so this is Paul's big contribution to the Jerusalem church. He's brought all these representatives from the Gentiles to help the Jewish Christians who are struggling at this time. They report on the mission. They talk about all the great things that God has done, and then they bring their contribution from the Gentile churches. Now, it's interesting because this particular passage does not mention their contribution, the collection that they had done. But we get from other passages that's what was happening here. That took place during this meeting in Jerusalem. There's a lot of tension going on beneath the surface. You may recall in Acts chapter 15, Paul had showed up because of the controversy between the Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians in Antioch. And they had to go and have a big, huge confrontation about basically, do you have to become a Jew to become a Christian? And that's still a problem. I mean, it was clearly a problem. There was a group there that thought you should have to become a Jew to become a Christian. Fortunately for the church as a whole, they decided, no, you don't have to become a Jew to become a Christian. These are 2 different religions. But the tensions between the 2 groups are still there. The Jewish Christians are still keeping kosher food laws, which means they can't eat with Gentiles. They can't even go into their houses on the Sabbath. It might make them unclean. There's still a lot of a lot of racial tension between the two groups, even though they're united in their faith in Jesus. And you just can't get rid of centuries and centuries of hard separation between these two groups when it comes to food and fellowship. And so the Jews have always sort of looked down their noses at Gentiles, and now all of a sudden there's lots of Gentiles that are becoming Christians and a lot of Jews becoming Christians. But we know that even if you know what's right, sometimes your worldview has been so drilled into you that it's still hard to put it into practice. The Jewish Christians may have known they should accept Gentiles, but it may have been hard for them to basically turn around on centuries and centuries of how they have looked at Gentiles as Jews worshiping God. And so there's a tension here between these two groups. And I imagine all through the first centuries of the church, Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians had problems trying to work together, and others managed to overcome those problems. What's interesting is Jewish Christians would have never taken up collection for Gentile churches. They may have known they shouldn't be prejudiced, but that would have been a step too far for most Jewish Christians. And so for these Gentile Christians to show up with a contribution, a large collection for the Jewish churches, that must have been a real eye-opener. That must have been something that they hadn't expected. I mean, you can almost imagine the scene. Here comes Paul and his group. And, every time Paul comes to town, there's a problem of some kind. There's a controversy. Many of these Christians remember when Paul was actually trying to kill them, that he had orders to arrest, torture, and even kill Christians. We remember the stoning of Stephen, that Paul was there encouraging the crowd to do that. Then he became a Christian, and the Jewish Christians didn't know, is this for real? Is he a spy? Is he a problem? Goes to Antioch, and they have a big controversy. He has to come back to Jerusalem to work that out. And so every time Paul's in town, trouble just seems to find him. And so when they hear that Paul is coming, I imagine even if they liked Paul, they might not be excited about him coming back to Jerusalem. The Jerusalem Christians and even the Jews had heard the rumors of riots breaking out in Greece and Asia Minor because of Paul's evangelism, because of his spreading the gospel. Maybe if you've been following us through this study, you'll know that he always started in the synagogue, and when the Jews finally got upset with him, and some did accept Jesus, some didn't, then he would move out into the Gentile populations. But due to trade back and forth from Israel and Judea out to the other Roman areas, they had heard rumors that it seemed like everywhere Paul went, there was some sort of riot, or he got stoned, or he was taken to court. And so here again, hearing the news that Paul is coming may not have gotten the elders there very excited. And not only because of the racial tension, but they hear Paul's coming with a large group of Gentile Christians. They're coming for a visit, an official visit of some kind. Can you imagine what they would have to do? Are we going to eat together? Are we going to, sit in separate tables? Why are they coming? Is there another controversy we have to solve? If you put yourself in the, James, the brother of Jesus, and the other elders in Jerusalem, they might not have been filled with excitement. They might not have, they probably were very uncomfortable with the impending meeting. What's going to happen? So you can imagine, with that kind of tension in the room, with the centuries of the racial problems they had with these Gentiles, the problems they'd had with Paul, you can imagine what it must have been like as they came in and all the Gentile representatives of the churches started bringing their contributions forward and putting it before the elders. it's the last thing that these Jewish elders, Christian elders, would have expected. I mean, it had to have just blown their minds. And like we mentioned earlier, part of that is because they would have never taken up a collection for Gentiles. That wouldn't have even crossed their minds. And so what an incredible moment this must have been, as they just all came forward and said, the church at Corinth gives you this much. The church at Philippi gives you this much. The church of Ephesus has contributed this much to help our brothers back here in Judea. That had to have been, especially with the mixed feelings they probably had anticipating the meeting, this was the last thing they expected and one of the best things it could do for them. They were stretched thin as it was with the famine, and this must have been a tremendous help for the elders, the leaders, and even the entire Judean Christian movement. So you need to kind of let that sink in. Picture that scene of what that must have been like, how great that must have been. And what a uniting moment to help overcome these sort of racial tensions. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And I want to pause there for a moment because again, ministers, even Christian church leaders, are still human beings with egos. And so it would be easy for them to think maybe Paul just wants to brag and show off about all the great work he's doing out there. And I like the way Luke puts this because I think it's accurate, and I think it's something that all church leaders need to remember. He told them one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. Because the fact of the matter is, if God is not working through us, there's no point in doing anything. If we have to allow God to take control of our ministry, God to take control of our energy, our any kind of power that comes through us, we need to recognize it's from God. And so Paul tells them all that God has done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified God. This again is a uniting moment, something that was desperately needed as the Christian mission expanded out from Judea and into the Gentile areas. It was an incredibly crucial moment for the early church as they shared what was going on. It must have been humbling for both parties, for everyone to finally come in and actually feel the acceptance, feel the Christian spirit that overcame their initial misgivings about maybe what this meeting was going to turn out to be. I imagine there was a tremendous spirit that came over this meeting between the Gentile Christians and the Jewish Christians. But there's still tension. They listened to Paul, they accepted the contribution, but they said, you can see how many thousands among the Jews have come to believe in Jesus. They're all zealous for the law. And they've been told about you that you teach all the Jews among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. Now, you need to understand what this means. They've already determined you don't have to become a Jew to become a Christian. But put yourself in the Jewish Christian's position in Judea. If you wanted to reach fellow Jews for Jesus, if you wanted to share the gospel of Jesus Christ and get them to convert, how would you go about that? It's apparent that many of the early Jewish Christians felt that the best way they could reach their neighbors was to be the best Jews they could possibly be, to keep the law meticulously, but with the Spirit of Christ. James, the brother of Jesus, was known for how meticulous he was about keeping the law of Moses. That even when he shared the gospel of Jesus, no one could fault him for his uprightness, for his following of the law. And so for many of them there, keeping the law was vital to their evangelistic efforts, to reaching other people for the sake of the gospel. And so they're having a hard time with Jews that are not following the law, and that was what that whole controversy in Antioch was about. And so they're hearing that Paul's out among the Gentiles, and the rumors are that he's telling Jews that are out there that they don't have to be Jews anymore to become Christian. They need to, if they become a Christian, that they have to just completely stop being Jewish and throw the whole Old Testament out. Now, that's not what Paul's teaching, but those are the rumors that are going around. And you can imagine if Paul's coming back to Jerusalem and people are hearing these things, especially the Christians, not to mention the non-Christian Jews, that it would be a problem. And so they're saying the rumors are that they're telling Paul, they're hearing rumors that you're teaching people not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. That would be a problem. That would cause a fellowship issue in Jerusalem. And they said, they will certainly hear that you have come. Paul was not a low-key person. People recognized him. People saw him. He was usually preaching on some street corner. People would still remember the Christian killer who then became a Christian. And so they're saying we've got to deal with this sort of a public relations issue if you're going to stick around in Jerusalem. So what was their solution? They said, hey, we've got 4 men who need to do a Nazirite vow, it looks like. And if you'll join them and pay their expenses and do this publicly, it'll make it clear that you are still going by the law, that these rumors about you are not true. And they're hoping this will sort of appease the rumor factory that's out there, stirring up trouble and saying Paul teaches against Moses, which if you read through Paul's letters, you'll see he does not do that. We do know that the kosher food laws were something that could be set aside. Even Jesus made comments along those lines. But he wasn't telling the Jews to stop being Jews. He wasn't telling them to neglect the Old Testament scriptures. And so they're trying to sort of solve this problem so that they can have unity. They can fellowship together without causing too many problems. The elders thought this would put a stop to it, that the Judean Christians would hear about Paul and hear what he did at the temple, and the unity that they so desperately want could be achieved. And so they come up with this solution. What's going on here really, though? Because the concern is not doctrine. Nowhere in here is there some doctrinal issue about the way we worship God, whether it's idolatry or immorality. That's none of the problems here. It's pretty much a cultural accommodation. That while Paul is in Jerusalem, they're wanting him to behave according to the law of Moses, even though as a Christian, we are no longer bound by the law of Moses. Is that a bad thing? Is a cultural accommodation here okay as a Christian? Now, Paul didn't have any trouble with Jewish customs. He was Jewish. He grew up that way. So that's not the issue here. But what's at stake here is maybe spiritually, as a Christian, should we accommodate culture if it doesn't go against our faith? That's one of the thorny questions that this passage is dealing with. Paul taught that the Gentiles did not have to be Jews in order to become Christians, but they're saying he's teaching Jews they have to quit being Jews to become Christians. And he never taught that either. This is about, are you going to follow the food laws? Are you going to follow the food and fellowship laws? Do we have Jews out there who are becoming unclean? And all through the Gentile world, that's a problem. Jews living among Gentiles have to walk a tightrope of keeping their laws and keeping separate from you got to be careful who you eat, what you eat, who you eat with, and and you got to make sure your plates are all clean and not unclean, purification laws. So this is a cultural accommodation that I think it's interesting that Christians are trying to make. So, and I believe with the best of intentions, so that they could reach other Jews with the gospel of Jesus Christ. What are the spiritual implications? I mean, think about it. As a Christian, how would we feel if there was a Jewish Christian who still worshiped God as a Jew, who still followed all the Jewish holidays, who still went to synagogue? Would that bother us? Have we ever thought about that? What if you had, what if there was an Arab Christian who still referred to God as Allah? Would that bother us? I've talked with Palestinian Christians, and they still refer to God as Allah. Allah is the God of Abraham. And they don't see any problem with that. But I imagine as a Westerner, that might bother us. How far do we go with cultural accommodation, language accommodation? I mean, where do we draw the line between culture and religious practice? As we're in the holiday season now, where it's Christmas time, most of us recognize that there's a very secular version of Christmas, but as Christians, we like to make it more of a spiritual experience. But there's nothing in the Bible that commands Christmas as a Christian holiday, but it's something that we practice. And I think that's fine as long as we don't treat it like it's some sort of Christian law that we celebrate it. But it's a nice time of year to remember that God did send his son in the form of a baby. So as a Christian, I like to make Christmas a little more spiritual. But there's other Christians that don't. Other Christians that say, oh, it was a made-up holiday, or the Christmas trees represent a pagan holiday, and they don't want to practice it. Well, this definitely comes under the Romans 14 matters of opinion. My personal opinion is that since the whole world stops and takes notice that God sent his son to earth at this time, I think as Christians we should take advantage of that. But if someone feels differently, that's okay too. Maybe your cultural background doesn't allow for that, and that's fine. But we need to think through these issues, because it's easy to confuse culture with religion and vice versa. And that's something that can cause problems if we're not careful. Apparently in the early church, there were many Christian Jews who continued to be very Jewish in their worship practices. They would go to synagogue on Saturdays, and then they would go and have a Christian worship on Sundays. How would we feel about that? Would that make us uncomfortable, or would that be okay? I think these were some of the issues that they were trying to work through in the early church. And as a missionary, we've had to kind of work through some of those things too. What does a Christian marriage mean in a culture where they don't have wedding ceremonies? They have a bride price or negotiated. The parents still choose the spouses, and they work out a business arrangement. How do we feel about that? Is that Christian, non-Christian? Is that a place where we culturally accommodate? This passage kind of informs us that there are times where cultural accommodation is appropriate, and there are times when it's not. So what's our call to action in all of this? Culture in and of itself is not evil, and we need to understand that. We need to know what's culture and what's not. What does it mean to be a Christian American versus an American Christian? And what I mean by that is that our faith should inform our nationality, and not the other way around. Our nationality should not inform our faith. And yet it's easy to confuse those two. Even in the way we share the message of Jesus in America, we're into the things like freedom, independence, democracy, how much of that do we allow to inform our Christian practice? Or do we get them confused? And when we go to another country, do we take our American Christian practice with them? So we need to always be Christians first, Americans second, that our faith is the priority. And if we get them confused, and I've known many people that do get them confused, it can be very, very dangerous when our Americanism or our patriotism or nationality of any kind would start to overwhelm our faith, would actually sort of tweak it a little. That's what they call syncretism, when we put two things together and come out with something very, very different. And that's happened in a lot of cultures, even where Christianity has been spread. And so we need to know the difference. We need to think about the difference. Yes, I am an American citizen, but my heart belongs to Jesus Christ. At the center of my being, the thing that drives my decision-making process and my budgeting is my faith in God, not my faith in America. And I'm very proud to be an American, but I recognize the priority in my life will always be my spiritual citizenship, not my national citizenship. You see, Christian faith doesn't allow for anything that causes divisions among people, that would divide Christians and cause problems just because they're of a different nationality. And yet, racism has divided so many people. We still see that struggle in our own country. But you go around the world, and there are, Christians of one nation fighting the Christians of another. I remember my grandfather telling me about World War II and how on Christmas Eve they could hear the Germans singing Christmas carols as well as the Americans singing Christmas carols, and that it felt very uncomfortable to be shooting at somebody who was a fellow Christian and having to struggle with those issues. And so we need to understand, as Christians, our faith needs to override any kind of racism, any kind of social construct, whether it's education, wealth, neighborhoods you live in, that we should never allow anything to divide us as Christians, that our faith in Jesus, our spiritual DNA, if you will, is that we are following God. And that makes anybody else who's following God our brothers and sisters in Christ. So during this time, especially this holiday season, let's try to let our faith overwhelm any kinds of prejudices we have against any other people, so that the Spirit of Christ will truly reign in our lives, and that at this time of year, those who don't believe in Jesus will see him in us. Thank you for joining me.